in the death of Mahogany Jackson. 6 of the 8 suspects in court today.
The day before Jackson died, she was put in Harris's car, and he, Pope, and McDowell took her to clean Harris's car out. Even though the defense claims Harris said they were taking her back to her house, that's when Harris is accused of pulling the trigger and shooting Jackson in the back of the head. Now, District Attorney Danny Carr calls this one of the most gruesome murders he's ever seen.
February 25th, 2024, at about 7:46 in the morning. A mother's phone lights up with a text message that will haunt her for the rest of her life. The words are simple, desperate, terrifying. I'm being held hostage in apartment 3. Don't call. Send the police. Hurry. The message came from her 20-year-old daughter, Mahogany Jackson, trapped inside a Birmingham apartment, fighting for survival. But here's what makes this case cut deeper than most crimes you'll ever hear about. The 8 people torturing Mahogany at that very moment weren't masked strangers who kicked down her door in the middle of the night. They weren't armed robbers or random attackers. Every single person hurting her was someone she knew, someone she trusted, someone she'd laughed with, confided in, considered a friend. For more than 30 hours, they held her captive. They moved her from location to location across Birmingham. They documented their crimes on video. And when Mahogany finally found one desperate moment to send that text, one chance to save her own life, they discovered what she'd done. That's when everything changed. That's when the worst truly began. This is the story of Mahogany Jackson, a young mother who learned the hardest lesson anyone can learn. Sometimes the most dangerous people in your life are the ones standing closest to you. Mahogany Jackson came into this world on April 29, 2003, in Jasper, Alabama. Her parents, Moses Jackson Jr. and Gail Maddox, welcomed a daughter who would grow up to be described by everyone who knew her as someone with a smile that could light up the darkest room. From her earliest years, Mahogany carried an energy that drew people toward her. She was loving, caring, and possessed an infectious warmth that made her the center of attention in any gathering. Her mother, Gail, would later recall how Mahogany had been a spirited child from the beginning. Even as a little girl, she had opinions about everything. What she wanted to wear, who she wanted to play with, how she wanted to spend her time. She wasn't rebellious in a destructive way, but she definitely had her own mind. Gail sometimes laughed when remembering how hard it was to get young Mahogany to do something she didn't want to do. That stubbornness would become both her greatest strength and ultimately a contributing factor to the tragedy that would claim her life. Growing up in the Birmingham area, Mahogany received her education through the Birmingham City school system. She attended local schools where teachers remembered her as bright and social. Her report cards might not have been perfect, but everyone who taught her remembered her personality. She had a way of making people feel seen, of making conversations feel important, of being fully present when she talked to you. She was a social butterfly, someone who made friends easily and kept those friendships close. As she moved through her teenage years, Mahogany developed a strong personality, the kind that refused to back down when she felt wronged. Some people called it confidence. Others called it being headstrong. Her family called it being a Jackson, claiming that stubborn determination ran in the bloodline. Either way, Mahogany knew who she was, and she never pretended to be anyone else. She didn't change her personality to fit in with different crowds. She brought her full self to every interaction, every relationship, every situation. By the time she reached her late teens, Mahogany had given birth to a daughter named Nydia. Becoming a mother at a young age transformed her perspective on life entirely. That little girl became everything to Mahogany. Friends and family would later say that you could see the change in Mahogany's eyes when she talked about her daughter. The wild party girl began to give way to a young woman who understood the weight of responsibility. Nydia wasn't just her child. She was her reason for getting up in the morning, her motivation to do better, her entire world compressed into one 3-year-old package. Mahogany documented everything about her daughter's life. Her phone was filled with photos and videos of Nydia learning to walk, learning to talk, playing at the park, eating her favorite foods. She posted about her daughter on social media constantly, sharing milestone moments with captions that revealed how deeply she loved being a mother. When Nydia said something funny, Mahogany would text it to her own mother immediately, laughing about how smart and clever her daughter was becoming. The relationship between Mahogany and Nydia was special in a way that everyone around them could see. Mahogany treated her daughter not just as a responsibility, but as a companion. They went everywhere together: shopping trips, family gatherings, visits to friends' houses. Nydia was always right there beside her mother, holding her hand, chattering away about whatever caught her attention. Mahogany was patient with her in ways that surprised people who remembered the more impulsive teenager she'd been just a few years earlier. But being a single mother in Birmingham came with challenges that Mahogany hadn't fully anticipated. The financial pressure was constant. Mahogany found herself relying on family support more than she wanted to, living in a situation that didn't match her dreams of independence and success. That's where the cosmetology school dream came from. Mahogany had always been good with hair and makeup. Her friends called her when they needed help getting ready for special occasions. She could braid hair in intricate patterns, create makeup looks that enhanced natural beauty, give advice on styles and colors. It was a skill set that came naturally to her, and she recognized it could become a career path. Mahogany had dreams that extended beyond the streets of Birmingham. She wanted to attend cosmetology school, to build a career doing hair and makeup, to create something stable for herself and her daughter. She loved the color pink, wore it whenever she could, and talked about opening her own salon one day where everything would be decorated in shades of rose and magenta. In December 2023, just 2 months before her life would end, Mahogany sent her mother a text message that revealed how seriously she was taking her future. The message read, "I'm 20, and I'm ready to get my life in order." Gail Maddox, her mother, noticed the shift in her daughter's behavior during those final months. Mahogany was actively trying to distance herself from certain people in her social circle. She was spending more time with her cousins, looking for stable employment, and genuinely trying to be the mother that Nydia deserved. The problem with changing your life when you're young and deeply connected to a certain crowd is that not everyone appreciates your growth. Some people take it personally when you start doing better than them. Some people see your success as a judgment on their own choices, and some people, as Mahogany would discover, refuse to let you walk away cleanly. But Mahogany remained connected to a group of people from her past, people she'd known for years, people she'd spent countless hours with, people she considered friends. There were 8 of them specifically, and their names would soon become infamous throughout Birmingham and beyond. Brandon Pope was 24 years old, a man who lived in Birmingham and moved through the streets with the kind of confidence that came from being known and respected in certain circles. By all accounts, he was someone who cared deeply about his reputation, about how others perceived him, about maintaining respect among his peers. In the world he operated in, respect wasn't just important. It was currency. It was survival. People who knew Brandon described him as someone who could be friendly and personable when things were going well, but who had a temper that could flare quickly when he felt disrespected. He'd grown up in Birmingham, navigated the same streets that Mahogany had, understood the unwritten rules that governed social interactions in their shared environment. He had his own apartment on Macmillan Avenue, a place that became a gathering spot for friends, a place where people could hang out, relax, and feel safe. Francis Harris, who most people knew by his street name, Ace, was 25. He moved through life with a certain edge, the kind of person who made decisions quickly and didn't waste time second-guessing himself. Friends described him as someone who was loyal to his crew, someone who would show up when called, someone who didn't back down from confrontation. Harris had a reputation in certain circles as someone you didn't want problems with, not because he was particularly violent, but because he was willing to follow through on threats that others might make but never act on. He'd been around the streets long enough to understand how respect worked, how power functioned, how the right action at the right time could establish your position in the social hierarchy. When Brandon Pope needed someone to do something, Francis Harris was exactly the type of person who would step up without hesitation. Jeremiah McDowell, known to his friends as Kodak, was only 18 years old. He was the youngest of the group, still carrying that teenage energy that makes young men feel invincible and immortal. He looked up to the older guys in the crew, wanted to prove himself worthy of their respect, wanted to show he could handle whatever came his way. For Jeremiah, being included in this group meant something. It meant being seen as mature, as capable, as someone who belonged with older, more experienced people. The pressure to prove himself, to demonstrate he wasn't just some kid they tolerated, but a real member of the crew, would play a role in the decisions he made during those 30 hours. At 18, he was legally an adult, but his judgment and decision-making still carried the impulsiveness of adolescence. Blair Green was 26, somewhere in the middle of the age spectrum for this group. Then there were the 4 women in the group. Tasia Lewis was 26, a woman who'd known Mahogany for years. They'd run in the same circles, attended some of the same gatherings, shared mutual friends. Their relationship had that complicated dynamic that often exists between women in tight-knit social groups, sometimes friendly, sometimes competitive, always aware of each other's presence and position within the larger circle. Tasia had her own apartment at Serenity Apartments, a place that would become central to this case. Having your own apartment gave you status in a world where many people were still living with family or bouncing between different places. It made you someone who could host gatherings, who could offer space when space was needed, who had a level of independence that others lacked. Senia McCall was 23, and like Tasia, she had history with Mahogany that stretched back, through time. They weren't strangers meeting for the first time. They had a past, shared memories, connections that made what would eventually happen even more difficult to comprehend. Senia was Tasia's roommate at Serenity Apartments, sharing the space and the responsibilities that came with it. For Senia, being part of this social circle provided a sense of belonging, a feeling of being connected to something larger than herself. She knew the people, understood the dynamics, recognized how conflicts worked, and how they typically got resolved. She'd witnessed arguments before, seen tensions flare up and die down, watched as disputes that seemed serious in the moment eventually faded into the background. Giovanni Clapp was 24, another member of this tight-knit social circle. Giovanni had her own life, her own concerns, her own daily struggles. She worked, paid bills, tried to navigate the challenges of young adulthood in Birmingham, but she was also loyal to her friends, willing to show up when called, ready to support the people in her circle when they needed her. That loyalty, misplaced and misdirected, would lead her into the worst decision of her life. And finally, there was Ariana Robinson, 23 years old, someone who would later be described as being on the periphery of events, present, but perhaps not as deeply involved as the others. Or so her defense attorneys would argue. Ariana's connection to the main group was less established than the others, her role in their social circle less defined. What brought her into this situation remains somewhat unclear. Maybe she was dating someone in the group. Maybe she was friends with one of the women. Maybe she just happened to be present when events began to unfold and found herself swept up in the momentum of what was happening. Regardless of how she got there, she ended up charged with the same crimes as everyone else. These 8 people weren't hardened criminals with long rap sheets. They weren't members of organized crime syndicates. They were young adults from Birmingham, living their lives, connected by friendship and shared experiences. And every single one of them knew Mahogany Jackson personally. The events that would lead to February 24, 2024, began with something that seems almost trivial when you first hear it: a gun and some money. According to court testimony that would later be presented by Detective Mark Green, the lead investigator on this case, Mahogany had taken a gun from someone in her social circle at some point before February 24th. The exact timeline remains unclear, buried in the kind of street disputes that rarely get fully documented until they explode into violence. But what is crystal clear is what happened next. Someone stole that gun back from Mahogany, along with money from her purse. In many circumstances, people might let something like that go. They might write it off as street drama, cut their losses, move on with their lives. But that wasn't Mahogany's style. She'd built her entire identity on not being someone you could steal from, not being someone who let disrespect slide, not being someone who backed down when she felt wronged. Mahogany did what she'd probably done 100 times before when facing a problem. she tracked down who was responsible. The trail led her directly to Brandon Pope. Whether he'd personally stolen the items or whether he was just holding them for someone else doesn't really matter in the end. What matters is that Mahogany believed Brandon had her property, and she was going to get it back. On February 24, 2024, Mahogany Jackson walked into Brandon Pope's apartment on McMillan Avenue. She didn't come alone, and she didn't come unprepared. She brought several people with her, and critically, she came armed. This wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. This was going to be a confrontation, and Mahogany intended to make sure Brandon understood she was serious. When she entered that apartment, she found Brandon surrounded by his friends. The atmosphere was already tense before she even opened her mouth. But Mahogany didn't waste time with pleasantries or explanations. She pulled out her weapon, aimed it at Brandon, and made her demand simple and direct. "Give me back my gun and my money." Brandon stood there, probably calculating his options, probably aware that every eye in the room was watching how he responded to being threatened by a woman in his own home. He claimed he didn't have the gun. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. But Mahogany wanted to be absolutely certain he wasn't lying to her face. That's when she made a decision that would set everything in motion. She ordered Brandon to strip down to his underwear. Right there, in front of his friends, with multiple witnesses watching, Mahogany forced a grown man to remove his clothes at gunpoint to prove he didn't have her property hidden on his body. For Brandon Pope, this wasn't just about the gun anymore. In the environment he lived in, where respect determined your standing, and your standing determined your safety. What Mahogany did to him was worse than physical violence. She'd humiliated him. She'd made him look weak. She'd demonstrated to everyone in that room that she could make him do whatever she wanted, that she had power over him, that his reputation meant nothing when she was holding the weapon. Brandon stood there in his underwear while Mahogany searched him and searched the apartment. She didn't find the gun, but the damage was already done. The humiliation had landed, hard and deep. Every person in that room would remember what they'd witnessed. They'd remember seeing Brandon Pope, stripped and powerless, unable to do anything but comply with a woman's demands. After Mahogany finished her search and realized the gun wasn't there, she left. She probably felt satisfied. She'd made her point. She'd shown Brandon and everyone else that stealing from her had consequences. She'd stood up for herself the way she always did. As far as she was concerned, the matter was settled. But inside that apartment, after Mahogany walked out the door, something else was happening. Brandon's embarrassment was transforming into rage. The image of himself standing in his underwear, humiliated in front of his friends, was burning into his mind. In his world, letting something like that go would be seen as weakness. It would be seen as acceptance. It would be seen as permission for others to disrespect him the same way. According to the testimony that would later emerge in court, Brandon turned to the people around him and issued a command that would change everything. He looked at his friends and said 4 words that sealed Mahogany's fate. Do something to her. Those 4 words launched a chain of events that would span more than 30 hours, involve 8 different people, cross multiple locations throughout Birmingham, and end with a 20-year-old mother dead in a dump site. What began as a theft dispute was about to become one of the most brutal crimes Birmingham had ever witnessed. The attack began almost immediately. Brandon Pope didn't want time for his anger to cool or for his friends to reconsider. He wanted action, and he wanted it fast. Within hours, the group had found Mahogany. They took her captive, and what happened next was captured on video by the participants themselves. Detective Mark Green would later testify in court about multiple separate videos that were recovered during the investigation. These weren't surveillance footage from security cameras. These were videos filmed by the suspects themselves on their personal phones. They documented their own crimes, creating evidence that would later be used to convict them in court. The initial assault took place at Brandon Pope's apartment on McMillan Avenue. According to Detective Green's testimony, which was based on reviewing these videos and interviewing witnesses, the group began by attacking Mahogany. Physically, they punched her repeatedly. They kicked her while she was on the ground. They spit on her. They stomped on her body as she tried to protect herself. But the physical violence was just the beginning. The group stripped Mahogany naked, removing every piece of clothing while she was surrounded by people she'd considered friends. Then they dragged her outside into the street by her hair. Neighbors might have seen something, people might have heard screams, but in that moment, no one intervened. Where are you watching from? Drop your locations in the comments below. And if you've made it this far into this story, leave a comment saying, "Still watching," so we can see who's staying with us through this important case. Detective Green testified that in the videos, you can hear one of the suspects yelling, "Pop the trunk." They forced Mahogany into the trunk of a car and drove her to a second location. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime of passion anymore. This was calculated. This was planned. This was 8 people working together to move a captive woman across the city without getting caught. They took her to the Serenity Apartments in southwest Birmingham, where Tasia Lewis and Cinia McCall were roommates. The apartment complex would later become a focal point of the investigation, the place where some of the worst abuse occurred, the place where Mahogany would send her desperate text message to her mother. What happened inside that apartment was described in court testimony, based on what Detective Green observed in the recovered videos. The testimony was explicit and detailed, presented to establish the severity of the crimes. Mahogany was assaulted at gunpoint by multiple members of the group. The abuse went on for hours. She was handcuffed. She was beaten with fists and with a baseball bat that someone found nearby. She was struck with weapons. She was spit on repeatedly by different members of the group. According to Detective Green's testimony, some of the suspects were on FaceTime during the assault, calling other people and asking if they wanted to come over and participate. This wasn't just about revenge against Mahogany anymore. It had transformed into something darker, something that suggested these 8 people had completely dehumanized their victim. Detective Green testified to another detail that reveals just how terrified Mahogany was during this ordeal. At some point during the assault, Mahogany had a bowel movement on the floor. This was her body's involuntary response to the extreme level of fear she was experiencing. When someone is that frightened, when their body is convinced they're about to die, sometimes biological functions shut down or activate involuntarily. The state's attorney later argued in court that this detail spoke to Mahogany's level of knowledge about what was going to happen to her. She knew, on some fundamental level, that she was not going to leave that apartment alive. But Mahogany Jackson was a fighter. She'd always been a fighter. Even after everything she'd endured, even after hours of torture and abuse, she hadn't given up. She was still looking for a way out, still searching for one chance to save herself, still hoping she'd get back to her 3-year-old daughter. On February 25, 2024, at 7:46 in the morning, that chance finally came. After more than 24 hours of being held captive, beaten, violated, and moved from location to location, Mahogany saw an opening. Her captors had let their guard down for just a moment. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they thought she was too broken to try anything. Maybe they just made a mistake. Mahogany grabbed her phone and typed out a message to her mother. She knew she had to be careful. If she called, they might hear her voice. If she sent a long message, they might catch her before she finished. So she kept it short, desperate, and direct. "I'm being held hostage in apartment 3. Don't call. Send the police. Hurry." She hit send, and included her location, Serenity Apartments. Then she probably put the phone down and prayed her mother would see it in time. Back home, Gail Maddox was out of town, on her way to pick up her son from the airport. When that text message came through and she read those words, her entire world stopped. Gail knew her daughter. She knew Mahogany was strong, independent, the kind of young woman who handled her own problems without asking for help. For Mahogany to send a message like that, something had to be terribly, desperately wrong. Gail immediately called 911. She sent family members to the location. She did everything a mother could do when her child is in danger. Birmingham police responded immediately, racing to Serenity Apartments with lights and sirens. They ran to apartment 3, ready to rescue a young mother who was fighting for her life. But when they broke down the door, the apartment was empty. There was nobody there. No Mahogany, no suspects, no signs of the horrific crimes that had been committed in that space just hours earlier. The group had already moved her, staying one step ahead of law enforcement. What happened next made everything infinitely worse. The suspects discovered what Mahogany had done. Someone checked her phone and saw the text message she'd sent to her family. They saw that she'd shared her location with her mother. They saw that she'd called for help. They realized the police were probably looking for them right now, probably circulating their descriptions, probably setting up a perimeter to find them. According to Detective Green's testimony, the group forced Mahogany to give them her phone password. They probably told her the same lie they'd been telling her throughout this ordeal. Cooperate and we'll let you go. Give us what we want and this will be over. You can go home to your daughter. You can see your mother again. Just give us the password. Mahogany, desperate to survive, desperate to believe there was still a chance she'd make it out alive, gave them the password. She unlocked her phone and handed over access to her entire digital life, her contacts, her messages, her social media accounts, everything. That's when Frances Ace Harris reportedly looked at the others and said something that revealed what they'd all been thinking. She ain't going nowhere. The text message that was supposed to save Mahogany's life had just guaranteed her death. She'd become a liability. She'd involved the police. She'd given her family their location. She'd created evidence that could be traced back to them. In their minds, she'd transformed from someone they were punishing into someone who could put them all in prison for the rest of their lives. The group made a decision. They loaded Mahogany into Frances Harris's car. Harris was driving. Brandon Pope and Jeremiah McDowell were with him. According to court testimony, they told Mahogany they were taking her to clean out Harris's car. Some of the defendants' attorneys would later claim Harris told Mahogany he was taking her home, but that was never the plan. They had a different destination in mind. They drove to a location in West Birmingham, to an illegal dump site on 17th Street Southwest and Laurel Avenue. The area was isolated, away from main roads, away from homes, away from witnesses. People used it to throw away things they didn't want anyone to find. Old furniture, broken appliances, construction debris, anything that couldn't be disposed of through normal channels. Locals had given the area a nickname that reflected its reputation, Dead Man's Road. When they arrived at that dump site, Mahogany was probably still holding on to hope. She'd survived more than 30 hours of torture. She'd given them everything they asked for. She'd cooperated at every turn. Maybe, despite everything, they would actually keep their word this time. Maybe she'd finally get to go home, hold her daughter, see her mother again, start rebuilding her life. But Frances Harris had different plans. According to testimony from Detective Mark Green, based on statements from the suspects themselves and evidence recovered at the scene, Harris raised his gun and shot Mahogany Jackson in the back of her head. One shot, execution style. 20 years old, a mother, a daughter, a young woman who'd just been trying to get her life together, who'd texted her mama 2 months earlier saying she was ready to change, who'd dreamed of becoming a cosmetologist and opening her own salon decorated entirely in pink. Gone. If you're finding value in this content, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with your loved ones so they can learn from these stories and stay aware of the dangers that exist even among people we think we know. But the group didn't just leave her body there and drive away. They tried to hide what they'd done. They covered Mahogany's body with old mattresses and debris from the dump site, treating her like garbage, like something to be disposed of and forgotten. They probably thought they'd bought themselves time, that it would be days or weeks before anyone found her, that the evidence would degrade, that witnesses would forget details, that their videos would remain secret. For hours, Mahogany's body lay there in that isolated spot while her family desperately searched. Her mother was still hoping police would find her daughter alive. Her 3-year-old daughter was waiting for her mama to come home, asking when she'd be back, not understanding why everyone around her looked so worried and sad. And the 8 people responsible went about their lives like nothing had happened, like they hadn't just tortured and murdered someone they'd known for years. But on February 26, 2024, at approximately 2:19 in the morning, someone walking through the area noticed something that didn't belong. When they moved the mattresses aside, they found Mahogany's body. the young mother who'd fought so hard to survive, who'd managed to send that desperate text to her mama, who'd endured hours of unspeakable violence, was finally found. But it was too late. Birmingham police arrived on scene and observed the victim lying on the side of the road, unresponsive, suffering from an apparent gunshot wound to the back of the head. Birmingham Fire and Rescue pronounced her deceased at the scene. What had started as a missing persons case on February 25th had now become a homicide investigation. But there was something those 8 people hadn't counted on. They'd filmed everything. They'd documented their crimes on multiple phones. They'd shared some of those videos with others. And in 2024, once a video exists in the digital world, it's almost impossible to contain it completely. The footage started circulating through Birmingham. People saw what had happened to Mahogany. They recognized faces. They knew names. And unlike so many cases where witnesses stay silent, where nobody wants to get involved, where communities protect their own even when their own are wrong, Birmingham said not this time. Tips started flooding into the Birmingham Police Department. People came forward with information. One witness, who had copies of some of the videos, walked into the station to clear his own name after people on social media started accusing him of involvement. He handed over evidence that would prove crucial to the investigation. The videos showed everything. They showed who was there, what happened, faces clearly enough to identify suspects, license plates on vehicles, and locations that could be pinpointed on a map. The suspects had created their own evidence. The witness who brought the videos to police became crucial to the investigation. This person had seen the footage circulating online and, wanting to clear their name, gathered copies and walked into the Birmingham Police Department with names, relationships, and context. Detective Mark Green and his team worked around the clock during those first 48 hours. They reviewed the videos frame by frame, identified each person, cross-referenced faces with social media, pulled phone records, tracked vehicles, and interviewed witnesses. Within 48 hours, Birmingham police had arrested 7 suspects. The arrests happened in coordinated raids across Birmingham. SWAT teams hit multiple locations simultaneously. The 8th suspect, Ariana Robinson, was arrested shortly after the initial 7 were taken into custody. Within 72 hours of Mahogany's body being discovered, all 8 people responsible for her death were sitting in jail cells. Birmingham Police Chief Scott Thurman stood at a press conference on February 28, 2024, and spoke about the case with obvious emotion in his voice. This was a man who'd been in law enforcement for years, who'd worked in the homicide unit, who'd seen terrible things that most people couldn't imagine. But even he was shaken by what had happened to Mahogany Jackson. The facts of this case are deplorable and sickening, Chief Thurman told the assembled reporters and cameras. Saddest of all, they were made public by the suspect's decision to videotape portions of this horrific act. He explained that investigators had determined Mahogany was a victim of assault, murder, and kidnapping. He emphasized that the suspects were not strangers to one another or to Mahogany. They were all acquaintances. This wasn't random violence. This was betrayal of the deepest kind. I served a number of years in the homicide unit, Chief Thurman continued. This is undoubtedly one of the most heinous acts I have seen in my career. It's absolutely disgusting. But he also took time to praise the community response. It's hurtful to know that 7 individuals could participate in such vile acts, but this case highlights the strength and the effectiveness of the partnership between the Birmingham Police Department and our community, as 7 suspects are now behind bars. The charges came swiftly and severely. Brandon Pope, the man who'd started everything with his command to do something to her, was charged with capital murder during a kidnapping. The charge carries the possibility of the death penalty in Alabama. Francis Ace Harris, believed to be the one who pulled the trigger, was charged with capital murder during a kidnapping and capital murder during sodomy. 2 separate capital charges, both death penalty eligible. Jeremiah Kodak McDowell, only 18 years old, was charged with capital murder during a kidnapping. His age would be irrelevant in determining his culpability. Under Alabama law, 18 is an adult, and adults charged with capital murder face adult consequences. The 4 women and Blair Green initially received felony murder charges, but as the case progressed through the court system, those charges would be upgraded. Giovanni Clapp, Blair Green, Cinia McCall, and Tatsia Lewis would all eventually face capital murder charges. Even Ariana Robinson, who some tried to portray as less involved than the others, would see her charges elevated to capital murder. All 8 suspects were denied bond. In Alabama, there's a no-bond policy for capital murder charges. Once you're charged with a crime that severe, you stay in jail until your case is resolved, either through a plea deal or a trial. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the mountain of evidence prosecutors had accumulated. During preliminary hearings in March 2024, Detective Mark Green walked the court through what he'd seen in those videos. He described the attacks in detail. He explained the timeline of events. He identified each suspect and their role in what happened. The courtroom atmosphere during these hearings was intense. Mahogany's family sat in the gallery, forced to listen as Detective Green described what had happened to their loved one. Some family members left the courtroom at certain points, unable to bear the graphic testimony. Others stayed, determined to hear every word, to understand exactly what Mahogany had endured, to bear witness to her suffering even though it tore them apart. The defense attorneys faced an uphill battle from the beginning. The video evidence was simply too overwhelming. They couldn't argue their clients weren't present because the footage clearly showed them. They couldn't argue about mistaken identity because faces were visible. They couldn't claim their clients were coerced into participating because the videos showed willing engagement. All they could really argue was levels of involvement, degrees of responsibility, and mitigating circumstances. Defense attorneys tried various strategies. Brandon Pope's lawyers argued he didn't participate in the physical assault, that there was no probable cause to hold him on certain charges. They pointed out that while he'd given the initial command, he hadn't personally committed all the acts that others had. The prosecution countered that under Alabama law, anyone who participates in a kidnapping that results in death can be charged with capital murder, regardless of who actually pulled the trigger. The judge wasn't persuaded by the defense arguments. Bond denied. Ariana Robinson's defense team tried to paint her as just a witness, someone who showed up after the assault was underway, someone who wasn't really involved in the core criminal acts. They argued she even offered to take Mahogany home, but others in the group refused after learning Mahogany had sent her location to her family. They presented her as someone who'd found herself in a situation that spiraled beyond her control, someone who didn't have the power or the courage to stop what was happening. The judge reviewed the evidence and came to a different conclusion. Her presence during the commission of these crimes made her complicit. Bond denied. For Jeremiah McDowell, his attorney Glennon Threet argued that his youth should be considered, that at 18 he was easily influenced by older members of the group, that he'd been following the lead of people he looked up to and respected. The argument had some emotional resonance, but legally, it didn't matter. Alabama law draws a clear line at 18. After that birthday, you're an adult in the eyes of the criminal justice system, subject to adult penalties for adult crimes. Bond denied. One by one, defense attorneys made their arguments. One by one, they were told the same thing. You're charged with capital murder. You're not going anywhere. The preliminary hearings also revealed some complexity in the charges. Initially, some defendants faced capital murder charges based on assault, while others faced felony murder charges. As judges reviewed the evidence and prosecutors refined their cases, some of these charges were adjusted. Capital murder charges based on specific acts were dismissed against Pope and McDowell at the preliminary hearing stage, though they still faced capital murder charges related to kidnapping. Giovanni Clapp's assault charge was reduced from second degree to third degree. As the case moved toward trial, the prosecution made a significant announcement. They would be seeking the death penalty for all 8 defendants. Jefferson County Deputy District Attorney Carissa Henrick filed notice with the court characterizing the case as especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel compared to other capital offenses. District Attorney Danny Carr explained the decision to the media. We certainly try to take the victim's family's position into consideration, and in this case, we talked with them and they were on board with us seeking the death penalty. This case qualifies as a death-eligible case. The facts and the law dictate that it qualifies as a death case. Gail Maddox, Mahogany's mother, made her position clear in a public statement. "I am in agreement with it because they showed my daughter no mercy. They laughed when they were torturing her. She didn't have a judge nor jury. The world would be better without them." Justice for Mahogany. The impact of Mahogany's murder extended far beyond the courtroom. Her daughter, Nydia, was only 3 years old when her mother was killed. Gail Maddox took custody of her granddaughter and faced the impossible task of raising a child while grieving the loss of her own daughter. Gail talked about how Nydia would ask for her mama, how she'd see other children with their mothers and cry. Halloween was especially difficult. Nydia saw other children trick-or-treating with their mothers and turned to Gail saying, "I love you, Grandma, but I want my mama." How do you explain to a 3-year-old that her mother is never coming back? Nydia kept some of her mother's belongings in her room, a pink scarf that still smelled like Mahogany's perfume, photos of the two of them together. Sometimes Gail would find Nydia talking to these photos, telling her mother about her day. On February 29, 2024, about 100 people gathered outside Serenity, apartments for a candlelight vigil in Mahogany's memory. They brought pink balloons, Mahogany's favorite color. They held candles, prayed together, and released the balloons into the sky. The vigil was a powerful moment of community solidarity. People who'd never met Mahogany came because they'd been moved by her story. Mothers brought their daughters, using the moment as a teaching opportunity about trust and safety. Family members spoke at the vigil, reading from Psalm 23. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." We stand united as a family, as a community, as a village, one family member said. "Love can keep us together. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow us all the days of our life, and we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The case also raised broader questions about social media, violence, and community responsibility. Some of the videos that the suspects filmed had been shared on social media before police recovered them. People had watched Mahogany being tortured and hadn't called police. They just passed the videos along like it was entertainment. This aspect of the case disturbed investigators and prosecutors. The videos had circulated through Facebook and text messages. People had seen them, recognized what was happening, and chosen not to intervene. District Attorney Danny Carr spoke about this. This one, unlike some others, the brutality kind of played itself out in real time because there's video. And then those videos got shared. The question of why people shared these videos without calling police speaks to something troubling about contemporary society. People have become so accustomed to consuming violent content through screens that when they encounter real violence, their first instinct is often to treat it like just another piece of content. But the Birmingham community's response after Mahogany's body was found showed something different. The tips that poured into the police department, the witnesses who came forward, the person who brought those videos to the station. All of it demonstrated that most people, when faced with evil, will choose to stand against it. As of the most recent court proceedings, all 8 defendants remain in custody awaiting trial. Some preliminary hearings have been held. Some charges have been adjusted as prosecutors refine their cases, but the core charges remain. Capital murder, with the state seeking the death penalty. The trials will likely be lengthy and difficult. Prosecutors will present those videos as evidence. Juries will see what happened to Mahogany. Family members will have to sit through testimony describing the worst moments of their loved one's life. The defendants will have their day in court, their opportunity to present their side of the story, their chance to argue for mercy. But regardless of what happens in those courtrooms, some facts remain unchangeable. Mahogany Jackson is gone. Nydia is growing up without her mother. Gail Maddox buried her daughter. And 8 people who could have chosen differently at any point during those 30 hours instead chose violence, cruelty, and murder. Technology played a complex role in this case. Mahogany's phone became her lifeline when she sent that desperate text. It was her last hope for survival. But that same technology was used against her when her captors forced her to give up her password, and the phones that the killers used to record their crimes became the evidence that convicted them. The videos they filmed were meant to document their power over Mahogany, to preserve the moment when they'd gotten their revenge. Instead, those videos became the primary evidence in a capital murder prosecution, documenting every crime and identifying every perpetrator. Community response matters. When people see something wrong, when they have information about a crime, when they can help bring justice, they have a responsibility to act. The Birmingham community's response to this case demonstrated that collective action can bring swift justice. As this case continues through the legal system, as trials approach and verdicts are eventually rendered, Mahogany Jackson's memory remains alive in the people who loved her. Her family keeps her spirit present by talking about her dreams, her love for her daughter, her plans for the future. Mahogany Jackson was not just a victim. She was a warrior. She was a mother who loved her daughter more than anything. She was a young woman with dreams of building something better. She was someone who refused to give up even when faced with unimaginable horror. And her family, her daughter, her community are making sure she's remembered that way. Thank you for watching this difficult but important story. If you've learned something about trust and safety and the importance of choosing your circle carefully, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others. These victims deserve to be remembered, and by spreading awareness, we honor their memory and potentially prevent future tragedies.